Here we go. This is the Senate. By the way, green, House of Representatives, tradition taken from the House of Commons in Britain, but we like to give it an Australian twist. It is the eucalyptus leaf colour. This is the new eucalyptus leaf colour. So when it comes out fresh, it's got that red tinge to it, and that's where this colour comes from. So again, House of Lords, and we've got the red colour here. Do we have the charger for
the
this?
UK one is the UK equivalent of the House of Lords.
Yes,
Okay.
but that's an inherited,
Yes.
not an elected role.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The name Senate, though, comes from the United States.
Rome.
Or Star Wars.
Did you say that?
To be fair though, that was around before Star Wars.
If you do go to the Parliament, do go up to the room where there is. Can you get something? Oh, thanks. There's a Lego version of the Parliament, and you can go in there, and kids love it. And if you go to the Senate, you'll see some characters from Star Wars that are in the Senate, so it's really cute. So this is the Senate. Obviously, red room. We've got half the numbers essentially. Constitution says basically we need half the numbers in the Senate. So there's 76 senators, 12 from each state, 2 from each of the territories. That gives us 76.
And do they need to have 6 from each state, or is it just half overall?
They need to have equal number from each state, and at the moment that's 12. And when it's an election, it's a half Senate election. So in other words, we have elections in Australia every 3 years for the House of Representatives. It's every 6-year terms for the Senate. Unless, asterisk, it's a double dissolution election, which is all about not getting money bills through the House of Representatives twice in 3 months, I think it is. And then it can be a trigger, doesn't necessarily, but can be a trigger that can be used to be pulled by the Prime Minister to cause a double dissolution, which means everyone in the whole Parliament is up for re-election. And that can backfire really badly.
The ACT and Northern Territory, we elect our senators
every 3 years. So it's only a 3-year term for the territories. Yeah. So Pocock will be up later.
And he
Is
will
that just sort of
absolutely
a-
crush it.
Is that just sort of a thing that if you've got 2 duds, you don't want to have to wait 6 years? Or is
No, I think it's just the way they set the territory government up. They just don't think territories should have the same rights.
They just
Yeah.
stuffed it up.
You know, but I mean, a 3-year term. Oh, so you're saying a 3-year term is not as good as a 6-year term?
Oh,
so
I
it's
think
less
6-year
right.
terms are perfectly sensible if they're a reasonable.
And it's a
senator.
neat mechanism as well, because what actually happens is with the numbers in the Senate being the House of Review, it's got this lag effect. Plus the quotas are different. So you get a bit of a mix. It's quite rare in Australia to get a majority in the House and the Senate. And, you know, this is opinion, but it could be argued that when you get that, you abuse that and you get turfed out pretty quick.
John Howard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his last term
Exactly
was,
what he did.
he had a majority in both. Alrighty. Same basic setup. By the way, the U-shape is really useful because you're not really debating with your teammates. As we mentioned, you do that in your private meetings beforehand. Debate is about across the floor. So this U-shape is good, but with the pinnacle being the chair of the meeting, the Speaker in the House of Representatives. Here in the Senate, that is the president. So we have a president in Australia. They run the Senate. They don't run the country. So if you do hear of the language of the president in the Australian context, we're talking about that person there. That's currently Ms. Sue Lyons. So yeah, that's the same shape because essentially the same work is going on here. We're debating bills and we've got this aisle here and we're voting on them.
The president also chosen from the senators.
Great question. Now, do you remember I said that the Speaker doesn't vote in the House of Representatives, can add a casting vote? Here in the Senate, it would be unconstitutional because, yes, they're a senator, which means they've come from one of these usually states. It would be unconstitutional if the president was taken out of voting because that state would not have equal representation. So in the Senate, the president always votes.
So the president is one of the senators.
Is one of the
But
senators
they vote.
and votes. Their vote is counted already. So there's not a casting vote here in the Senate, an extra vote if it's 50-50. That means that if the Senate has a 50-50 vote and there's no more casting vote, the Constitution says to pass a bill, you need a majority. And 50% is not a majority, so the bill would not pass. The bill would not proceed. Well, someone mentioned as well the backbenchers. Yeah. So essentially, it might be actually a little easier to do it on the House. And I'll try and zoom in here as well. There we go. Okay, so you'll notice in the House that on the front benches on either side, the government and the opposition side, there's no tables. So these are called the front benches. And on the government side, you've got ministers. There are some assistant ministers and bits and pieces behind them, but essentially you're talking about an order of loose hierarchy, where the front of your team is the prime minister, the leader of your team, and the opposition leader. So you've got the leader, then the ministers, and they're essentially, this is where executive government comes in. They're essentially the bosses of government departments. Okay, so the Minister of Defense runs the Defense Force. The Minister of Education is running the education portfolio, and the government department that sits under that. And then on the other side, you've got the shadow ministers. So they usually pair up so that the shadow minister, that's their area of expertise, and they're going to quiz the minister who has the same portfolio, essentially. There are ministers and shadow ministers in the Senate as well. And so you'll get in the Senate, for example, in question time, you might say, this is a question for the minister representing the minister for blah, 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 blah. Or the senator representing the shadow minister for the other place. They always say the other place instead of like the House of Representatives or the Senate. Not our place, but the other place. So that can kind of happen there. So they're the ministers and shadow ministers. Anyone that's not a minister is a private member or backbencher. Sorry, backbenchers for in the opposition, in the parties, they're backbenchers. And then you've obviously got your independents as well. A private member is anyone that's not the prime minister or ministers. So all the opposition, all the crossbench, all the backbenchers. And there's some select times where there's time for private members' bills. So that is when a non-ministerial government member, or basically anyone else, can put a bill forward. If it's a private member's bill from an independent, from a minor party, from an opposition, or maybe even from a government private member that's not in the minister, then you could argue it's got a much lower success rate of passing. Certainly the House of Representatives, where the government's got the majority. But a lot of the work doesn't happen in this room. A lot of the work is happening in negotiations around it. And actually what will end up happening is quite often the independents or the minor parties might have a good bill and it's too good. And the government will go, if you introduce this, I'm paraphrasing quite a bit, but if you introduce this, it's not going to go anywhere. Why don't you work with us and we'll develop it? So we get all the credit.
Or we'll amalgamate it into
We'll
a
amalgamate.
omnibus thing.
Yeah, and push it a lot through. Yeah. Daryl asks, how often do private members' bills get up? I'm not sure on the stats.
Most don't.
Yeah, I would say most don't because they're not government-supported legislation. Yeah.
And they have to kick off here.
They don't all have to kick off here. You can start a bill in the House, in the Senate,
Okay.
but not if it spends money. So if it's a money bill, it has to start in the House of Representatives. Now, this gets interesting for players like David Pocock.
Yeah.
If he wants to spend money, he can't introduce it here in the Senate. He would have to get it co-sponsored and get someone else to bring it up in the House of Representatives. All right, you want a good fun nuts and bolts thing? Okay. In the Senate and the House of Representatives, they're going to debate the bill, and the Senate, because we'll look at the numbers actually first, You can see that the government do not have a majority here in the Senate. They're behind. 39 is your target here to get a majority in the Senate. And you'll see that no one's on 39. No one is over a majority on their own, which means that if they disagree, it will come down to the crossbench. So the crossbench are hugely powerful in the Senate. And that's why this ends up being the House of Review, because stuff needs to get negotiated. If the opposition are against it, they're going to need to get the minor parties and the independents, or at least enough on board. Now, 39 is what you need here. The opposition are on 31. They only need 8. If you look carefully, the Australian Greens are on 11. In other words, if the Australian Greens go with the opposition, done deal, it's over. They've given 11 out of 8. It's over. So the government require the Australian Greens and at least 2 more to get 13 to get them to 39. Now, you do want to get bipartisan support, because obviously if your team's turfed out at the next election, if you want longevity in your bill, you'd prefer the opposition to be on board. You want as much as possible, because you know, when it goes into the actual vote, things can go awry. So you want to get as much as possible. The government are going to need an extra 13. Where was I going with this?
39, is it?
39 for a majority out of the 76.
When Lydia Thorpe defected from the Greens to become independent, it changed it reduced the amount of clout that David Pocock had. Is that right?
No.
Not really. It didn't make too much of a mix of a difference, because she's still in the crossbench.
Yeah.
It didn't make too much of a difference.
Okay.
So she went from being one of the 12 Australian Greens to adding an extra one to the independents. The government, for example, they need 13 extras. They used to have to get the Australian Greens and 1 more. Could have been David Pocock, could have been Jackie Lambie.
Right. That's what.
Jackie Lambie's gone down as well. Like, she was 2. Tammy Tyrrell has gone to become an independent.
Okay.
So that's now gone up to 4 independents.
Yeah.
Only 1 of them was voted in as an independent. You know, so these are the mixes that can change. Yeah. Oh, that's right. The nuts and bolts about this.
Yeah.
So the Senate might then negotiate and say, well, all right, we like this bill generally, but to get our support, and you're going to need it because the opposition's against it, we want this and we want this. One of the jobs that the Governor General has is to make sure that the House of Representatives and the Senate have agreed on exactly the same bill. So they'll get, I think they do get the 2.
Do they do it in SharePoint?
Print. They do it on paper.
Okay.
It's done on paper. There's actually tubes through Parliament House. They don't use this system anymore, where, you know, like in Coles, and they stick money up, the pneumatics, yeah. They don't use that anymore, but they still print out the stuff.
Put documents side by side and say so many changes, so many differences.
I guess so, but someone has to do, that's his job.
But can you imagine how much paper gets printed out, because every change needs
Yep.
to be then sent?
Yeah, it's all stacked, it's all pigeonholed in order for the Parliament. Yeah, it's incredible.
That would be one of the first things I would do, is digitize that.
And of course, what happens is they'll come in with an amendment and go, right, I'm circulating amendments in my name, these next 4 pages or whatever, and the printer's going berserk, and the attendants are all
And
sharing these out.
all the post-it notes and the
Yeah,
20 pictures
all of that.
and the blah, blah.
So now the Senate might go, okay, we've passed it and we've agreed to it, but now this bill has amendments. It's changed. The House of Representatives does not agree to that. So the House, the bill goes back to the House to be agreed to. That's the narrative.
In real life.
In real life, the Senate can't change or make money bills. So if it's spending money, the Senate actually doesn't amend the bill. What the Senate does is they go through the whole process and they decide what they would agree to. Then they send a message to the other place and they amend the bill and send an updated version back to the Senate, because the House can only change those money bills, which is now the updated version that the Senate is now happy to agree to. There's a part called consideration in detail as well. So going back a step, for a bill to pass either the House of Representatives or the Senate, it's read out by the clerk 3 times. The first is just a procedural thing. I'm introducing this bill. Oh, the bill is just the short title of the bill.
Oh, it's only the title.
The title of the bill, yeah. So a bill to amend the blah blah,
NDIS arrangements.
yeah. Number 3-1-1, whatever it is. So they'll just read the short title, and then that the first one is usually procedural, and now it's tabled, and it might not come back for another week or whatever. They might go, and I ask that the bill be read a second time. They might ask straight away. And then there's second reading debate. So then they'll back and forth. This is a bad idea for Australia. This is great, blah, 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 blah. And a vote. And if they voted on, it's not passed that chamber. It's just, we think that this bill has merit and it's probably going to pass later on, but there's some procedural stuff. Then it goes into something called consideration in detail. The Speaker, and I think the President as well, will leave their chair and they'll actually sit down lower at the table and kind of run a meeting from there. And it's kind of like a lower key. Let's go through the nuts and bolts of this. Let's chuck in some amendments. Let's tweak it. What do you reckon? That sort of stuff.
Still only the senators. So can they have legal advisors helping them at that point?
They can have advisors.
Some stuff, right?
They can have advisors in there. So there's advisors boxes, but they're not allowed onto the floor. Yeah. But a lot of this is like the negotiations and stuff will happen before they come in. So that's why between first and second reading, there might be 2 weeks or whatever, because they're going now and negotiating and working out some nuts and bolts.
So while they're in the sitting time, like how long is sitting? Like do they sit for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time?
Yeah.
Depends on when.
So are they wanting to get all these bills done in 3 weeks and they all go home and meet with their elected
Not
work on
necessarily.
developing bills and then whatever, then they come back and do a whole bunch more?
There's
He's like, no, none of that happens.
well, sort of.
He's like, that's not what happens. Sorry.
Sort of. I mean, there's a huge range, right? The fastest bill, I think, in this parliament was an hour and 15 minutes through both chambers that was signed by the Governor General that afternoon.
What was that about?
That was reneging on the zoning for the second new updated Russian embassy that is right near Parliament House. Because both sides were like, yep, done, yep, no disagreement, yep, done, signed, gone. Right?
No, the evening news.
And you remember the guy was bunkered in on site and all that sort of stuff? Yeah. So an hour and 15 minutes. I mean, that's ridiculously fast. And pretty unheard of.
I'm gonna tell every American I meet that's
It's definitely the fastest in this
It's
parliament.
actually the exception rather than the
Yeah, that's super rare.
still.
But then, most bills we're talking a couple of weeks, 6-8 weeks, something like that. And some
like
could be
debated,
months.
then everyone goes home, then you come back and you're revisiting that bill. So
Absolutely.
But that's important too. Everyone goes
Yeah,
home
go and
to go and consult with everyone in the election. With the theories.
Or just get hammered by negative phone calls and emails. That's why the phone calls and emails to electoral officers
Why do I never feel that I've ever been consulted about it?
You have to be the squeaky wheel, though, I guess.
Yeah, and there might be arguments why you do want to push
Just
some
not
things
checking
through
their heads up
fast.
on social media well, because you put it out and said, "This is what we're
Yes.
voting on. What are you guys?"
Yeah.
doing?" And then you get this great discussion happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love it.
And the government of the day, I'm not meaning this particular government, the government of the day might put some pressure on, go, we need this one done this sitting week. Sitting weeks, we're talking generally 20 weeks of the year, usually in 2-week blocks, Monday to Thursday. Generally. There's a few mismatches because budget will be here and different things are going on, but essentially that's the sort of
What do
pattern.
they do on Friday?
Travel, go home.
So even in the middle of that block, the middle
Yep.
of the 2 weeks, they'll take that long
A
weekend
3-day
and go home
weekend.
again.
Depending on where they are.
Right.
Never see their family.
Yeah. And maybe, I can't speak. I don't know what all their schedules are, but
Context that if you ever want to get
maybe the
somebody to
WA
come to an
ones
event,
might not.
That would be the time, right?
Yeah.
That weekend.
Well, and it is a good one to strategically think about the sitting calendar, which is all online. It's all on Parliament House website. So you can see the sitting calendar. I can tell you who do follow the sitting calendar are the climate activists out on Melbourne Avenue, because they know exactly the day that the parliamentarians are coming up that road. So, it's great data. It's good to use. Right. where we're up to. Yeah, you can see here that the government are behind, the opposition are ahead. By the way, you can see the list of parties in the coalition in the Senate. Like this is when we talk about the coalition. That's good to keep in mind. There is nothing saying that the coalition, any accents on anything, has to be the Liberal and the Nationals. It's actually not. For example, here it's the Nationals, Liberal National Party of Queensland, and the Country Liberal Party. But a coalition, for government's sake, could be any mishmash.
That was the
Probably the
original
rest.
idea.
Would you agree, Alec?
Yeah.
That was the rationale behind.
Getting the Senate.
Yeah, getting that federation.
It's to
it's a
get-
very tricky thing.
It's population, right?
Yeah.
If you imagine the House of Representatives, the population of Australia, over 50% of the electorates are New South Wales, Victoria.
Yep.
You could say, okay, let's say that those electorates ganged up, even up the whole East Coast, and so we're going to do high-speed rail between Sydney and Brisbane. You go yes, because I come around through here. And those electorates would have over 50% of the House of Representatives, and it would pass. And in that, they say, and South Australia's going to pay for it, and WA is going to pay for it, and Tasmania's going to pay for it. Well, now it goes to the Senate. And this is what the drafters of the Constitution were about, was like they needed to get those other colonies on board, and to suffice and satisfy them, we have the Senate.
Yeah.
And in the Senate, they have equal representation. Now that bill comes to the Senate, and WA is not going to vote for it, Tassie's not going to vote for it, NT, and then it'll get quashed. All good with the Senate? We'll move on. Passage of a bill. So essentially, I mean, we've pretty much covered it already. Passage of a bill. Generally speaking, the government will introduce the bill in the House of Representatives.